Oompa Loompas, everyone said at once. Oompa Loompas? Imported directly from Loompa said Mr. Wonka proudly. There's no such place, said Mrs. Salt. Excuse me, dear lady, but Mr. Wonka, cried Miss Salt, I am a teacher of geography. Oh, then you'll know all about it, said Mr. Wonka, and oh, what a terrible country it is. Nothing but thick jungles infested by the most dangerous beasts in the world. Hornswogglers and snozzwangers, and those terrible wicked whangdoodles. A whangdoodle would eat 10 Oompa Loompas for breakfast and come galloping back for a second helping. When I went out there, I found the little Oompa Loompas living in tree houses. They had to live in the tree houses to escape from the Whangdoodles and the Hornswogglers and the Snozzwangers. And they were living on green caterpillars. And the caterpillars tasted revolting. And the Oompa Loompas spent every moment of their days climbing through the treetops, looking for other things to mash up with the caterpillars to make them taste better. Red beetles, for instance, the eucalyptus leaves, the bark of the bongbong tree, all of them beastly, but not so beastly as the caterpillars. Poor little Oompa Loompas. But they couldn't get it. They longed for more than one thing they longed for than any other thing in the world was the cocoa bean. But they couldn't get it. An Oompa Loompa was lucky if he found 3 or 4 cocoa beans a year. But how they craved them! They used to dream about cocoa beans all night and talk about them all day, and had only to mention the word cocoa, and the Oompa Loompa, and he would start dribbling in the mouth. The cocoa bean, Mr. Wonka continued, which grows in the cocoa bean tree, happens to be the thing from which all chocolate is made. You cannot make chocolate without a cocoa bean. The cocoa bean is chocolate. I myself use billions of cocoa beans every week in this factory. And so, my dear children, as soon as I discovered that the Oompa Loompas were crazy about this particular food, I climbed up to their treehouse village and poked my head in through the door of the treehouse belonging to the leader of the tribe. The poor little fellow, looking thin and starved, was sitting there trying to eat a bowl full of mashed up green caterpillars without being sick. Look here, I said, speaking not in English, of course, but in Oompa Loompa-ish. Look here, if you and all your people will come back to my country and live in my factory, you can have all the cocoa beans you want. I've got mountains of them in my storehouses. You can have cocoa beans every meal. You can have cocoa beans anytime you want. You can gorge yourself silly on them. I'll even pay your wages in cocoa beans if you wish. You really mean it? Asked the Oompa Loompa leader, leaping up from his chair. Of course I mean it, I said. And you can have chocolate as well. Chocolate tastes even better than cocoa beans because it's got milk and sugar added. The little man gave a great whoop of joy and threw his bowl of mashed caterpillars right out of the treehouse window. It's a deal, he cried. Come on, let's go. So I shipped them all over here, every man, woman, and child in Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing cases with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They are wonderful workers. They all speak English now. They love dancing and music. They are always making up songs. I expect you will hear a good deal of singing today from time to time. I must warn you, though, they are all rather mischievous. They like jokes. They still wear the same kind of clothes they wore in the jungle. They insist upon it. The men, as you see for yourselves across the river, wear only deerskin. The women wear leaves, and the children wear nothing at all. These women use fresh leaves every day. Daddy, shouted Veruca Salt, the girl who got everything she wanted. Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa. I want you to get me an Oompa Loompa. I want an Oompa Loompa right away. I want to take it home with me. Go on, Daddy, get me an Oompa Loompa. Now, my pet, her father said to her. We mustn't interrupt Mr. Wonka. But I want an Oompa Loompa, screamed Veruca. All right, Veruca, all right, but I can't get it for you this second. Please be patient. I'll see you have one before the day is out. Augustus, shouted Mrs. Gloop. Augustus, sweetheart, Don't you think you'd had better not do that? Augustus Gloop, as you might have guessed, had quietly sneaked down to the edge of the river, and he was now kneeling over the riverbank, scooping hot chocolate melted into his mouth as fast as he could from his hand. Chapter 17, Augustus Gloop Gets a Pipe. When Mr. Wonka turned around and saw what Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh, no, please, Augustus, please! I beg of you not to do that. My chocolate must be untouched by human hands." "Augustus," called Mrs. Gloop, "didn't you hear what the man said? Come with me from the river at once." "This stuff is fabulous," said Augustus, making not the slightest notice of his mother or Mr. Wonka. "Gosh, I need a bucket to drink it properly." "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and wagging his stick in the air, "you must come away. You are dirtying my chocolate." "Augustus!" cried Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus!" cried Mr. Gloop. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. He was now lying full length on the ground with his head far out over the river, licking up the chocolate like a dog. "Augustus," shouted Mrs. Gloop, "you'll be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1,000,000 people over the country." "Be careful, Augustus," cried Mr. Gloop. "You're leaning too far." Mr. Gloop was absolutely right, for suddenly there was a shriek and then a splash, and into the river went Augustus Gloop, and in 1 second he had disappeared under the brown surface. "Save him!" screamed Mrs. Gloop, going white in the face and waving her umbrella about. "He'll drown! He can't swim a yard! Save him! Save him!" "Goodness heavens, woman," said Mr. Gloop, "I'm not diving in there. I've got my best suit on." Augustus Gloop's face came up again from the surface, painted brown with chocolate. "Help! Help! Help!" cried Augustus. "Fish me out!" "Don't just stand there!" Mrs. Gloop screamed at Mr. Gloop. "Do something!" "I doing something? I am doing something," said Mr. Gloop, who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. But while he was doing this, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer towards the mouth of one of the great pipes that was dangling down into the river. Then, all at once, the powerful suction took hold of him completely, and he was pulled under the surface and then into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd on the riverbank waited breathlessly to see where he would come out. "Here he goes!" somebody shouted, pointing upward, and sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gloop could be clearly seen shooting up inside it, head first like a torpedo. "Help! Murder! Police!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, come back at once! Where are you going?" "It's a wonder to me," said Mr. Gloop, "how that pipe is big enough for him to go through it." "It isn't big enough," said Charlie Bucket. "Oh dear, look, he's slowing down." "So he is," said Grandpa Joe. "He's going to stick," said Charlie. "I think he is," said Grandpa Joe. "By golly, he has stuck," said Charlie. "It's his stomach that's done it," said Mr. Gloop. "He's blocked the whole pipe," said Grandpa Joe. "Smash the pipe!" yelled Mrs. Gloop, still waving her umbrella. "Augustus, come out of there at once!" The watchers below could see the chocolate swishing around the boy in the pipe, and they could see it building up behind him in a solid mass, pushing against his blockage. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give. Something did give, and that something was Augustus. Woof! Up he shot again like a bullet in the barrel of a gun. "He's disappeared!" yelled Mrs. Gloop. "Where does that pipe go? Quick, call the fire brigade!" "Keep calm," said Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There is no danger whatsoever. Augustus has gone on a little journey. That's all, a most interesting little journey, but he'll come out of it just fine. You wait and see." "How can he possibly come out of it just fine?" said Mrs. Gloop. "He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds." "Impossible," said Mr. Wonka. "Unthinkable, inconceivable, absurd. He could never be made into marshmallow." "And why not, may I ask?" shouted Mrs. Gloop. "Because that pipe doesn't go anywhere near it. That pipe," the one Augustus went up, "happens to lead directly into the room where I make the most delicious kind of chocolate-flavored, chocolate-coated fudge." "Then he'll be made into strawberry-flavored, chocolate-coated fudge," screamed Mrs. Globe. "My poor Augustus! They'll be selling him by the pound all over the country tomorrow morning." "Quite right," said Mr. Globe. "I know I'm right," said Mrs. Globe. "It's beyond a joke," said Mr. Globe. "Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so," cried Mrs. Globe. "Just look at him, he's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh like that when my boy's gone up the pipe? You monster!" She shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka as though she were going to run him through. "You think it's a joke, do you? You think that sucking up my boy into the fudge room like this is one big colossal joke?" "He'll be perfectly safe," said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. "He'll be chocolate fudge," said Mrs. Globe. "Never," said Mr. Wonka. "Of course he will," shouted Mrs. Globe. "I wouldn't allow it," said Mr. Wonka. "And why not?" said Mrs. Globe. "Because the taste would be terrible," said Mr. Wonka. "Just imagine it. Augustus flavored chocolate coated globe. No one would buy it." "They most certainly would," cried Mr. Globe. "I don't want to think about it," shrieked Mrs. Globe. "Nor do I," said Mr. Wonka. "And I promise you, madam, that your darling boy is perfectly safe." "If he's perfectly safe, then where is he?" shouted Mrs. Globe. "Lead me to him this instant." Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his fingers sharply. Click, 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 3 times. Immediately, an Oompa Loompa appeared, as if from nowhere, and stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing beautiful white teeth. His skin was rosy white, as his long hair was golden brown, and the top of his head came just above the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the unusual deerskin shrug slung over his shoulder. "Now listen to me, Mr. Wonka," said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. "I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Globe up to the fudge room and help them to find their son Augustus. He's gone up the pipe." The Oompa Loompa took one look at Mrs. Globe and exploded into peals of laughter. "Oh, do be quiet," said Mr. Wonka. "Control yourself. Pull yourself together. Mrs. Globe doesn't think this is funny at all." "You can say that again," said Mrs. Globe. "Go straight to the fudge room," Mr. Wonka said to the Oompa Loompa, "and when you get there, take a long stick and start poking around inside the big chocolate mixing barrel. I'm almost certain you'll find him in there, but you better hurry. You better look sharp. You'll have to hurry. If you leave him in the chocolate barrel mixing too long, he's liable to get poured out into the fudge boiler, and that really would be a disaster, wouldn't it? My fudge would become quite uneatable." Mrs. Globe let out a shriek of fury. "Oh, I'm joking," Mr. Wonka giggled madly behind his beard. "I didn't mean it. Forgive me. I'm sorry. Goodbye, Mrs. Globe. And Mr. Globe, goodbye. I'll see you later." As Mr. and Mrs. Globe and their tiny escort hurried away, the 5 Oompa Loompas on the far side of the river suddenly began hopping and dancing about and beating wildly upon a number of very small drums. "Augustus Globe," they chanted. "Augustus Globe, Augustus Globe, Augustus Globe." "Grandpa," cried Charlie, "listen to them, Grandpa. What are they doing?" "Shh," whispered Grandpa Joe. "I think they're going to sing us a song."